my parents invited me to attend Hitchin Spiritualist Church because they had just moved to the area and wanted to find out where spiritual healers were prominent so that they could have a top-up every now and again, as my mother called it. And it turned out to be about a 10-minute walk from their place to Hitchin Spiritualist Church, and I got invited with family. And we went along and we listened to mediums, and very interesting, very, very interesting, because I have an open mind, so it was no problem. And coming out of the service, a woman grabbed my arm and she said, "Oh, Brian, I have to tell you that I've seen a spirit guide with you, and he said to me that you're going to do great things for the Spiritualist Church in the 1980s. Well, I thought, no, well, I got no plans on doing anything for anybody of that nature. And then she said, he's going to show himself to you very shortly. And he's a Tibetan guide. And he wants to show himself to you. Well, that freaked me out, I can tell you. And I think for the next few weeks I slept with one eye open. And then as the weeks went by, nothing happened, so I forgot about it. And the early hours of the morning, a month or 6 weeks later, I woke up at about 2 o'clock, I think it was, 3 o'clock in the morning. And there was this apparition at the side of me. It was a Tibetan dressed in a leather tunic, staring at me. But he was like luminous, and he was all lit up. I could see every line on his face. It was amazing. I, far from being frightened, I just stared at him, and he stared at me. And what struck me as amazing was he had a golden helmet, shining bright, and I was fascinated with it, and it came over the eyes like that, down to the nose here, down past the ears, cut away from the ears, and came up to a point. Well, I found out later that that was the basic shape of Tibetan headwear. Well, I knew absolutely nothing about that, because I'd not been interested in any Tibetan philosophies or anything like that. And anyway, we stared at each other for seemed like ages. I was noting his tunic and everything. And then he put his hands out like that. And the love that hit me was amazing. I just can't put that into words. It wafted through me to such an extent that it was almost unbearable, if you can accept that. But it was amazing. And he, with his smile and beautiful eyes, spiritual eyes, I learnt in later years that people of that nature have spiritual eyes where you can see their very soul. Eyes are the mirrors of the soul. And anyway, and then he faded, just disappeared, gone. And far from being frightened, I just said, "Don't go, don't go." And it left me feeling absolutely incredibly wide awake and pondering on what I'd seen. My first experience, I suppose you could say, my first psychic or spiritual experience, or whatever you want to call it. And that was, I just, I forgot to say that I put out my hand like that, and my wife was next to me, not this one, but the previous one.
This one.
I could hear the clock ticking. I looked at the light, the street lamp outside through a chink in the curtains. I looked back, it's still there. So I wasn't dreaming that. I know the difference between dreaming and actual daylight reality. I'm an engineer by profession, so I think realistically. But that was truly amazing. And that, as the days went by. I used to go to the spiritual healing sanctuary in Chesham just to talk to like-minded people. And there was a gentleman there. He was a retired clergyman, and he was very interested in spiritual and psychic happenings. And he was staying for a few days for recuperation. We got chatting, and he said, "Oh, come up to my room where we can be quiet and just have a nice long chat." So he led the way to his room, one of the bedrooms in the sanctuary. He walked in first. I followed him, and he turned round, and he was absolutely amazed like that. I said, "What's the matter, Fred?" He said, "Good grief, I've just seen like a Zulu warrior follow you in the room." And he was so tall, his head went through the lintel over the doorway. And he said he's got wonderful ostrich headdress. He said, "I think he's a minder for you, or a guide, as they call. Well, I didn't see him, so I just had to take Fred's word for it." Well, we had a good chat for about an hour, something like that. Anyway, a few days later, I was just daydreaming at home, just sitting, thinking what a wonderful day it is and looking out into the garden. And I happened to see this Zulu with his headdress on. Most amazing. And I just stared, he stared at me. And once again, he put one hand up like that, and the love that hit me was just absolutely amazing. So I thought, well, was that the Zulu that Fred saw and he told me about? So anyway, I let it go at that, and I attended spiritualist church in Chesham as well as in Hitchin occasionally when I was over at Hitchin with my parents. But Chesham one more local. And mediums, when they came to me, said there was, "Oh, got this Zulu with you." So I presumed that he would be the latest guide, as they called them. It's all new to me, very new. So that was proof, evidence that the Tibetan existed, because I saw him. I actually saw the Zulu for a few brief moments, and then, having pointed out several times during spiritualist meetings. So I later learnt that, in talking to Mike down at the sanctuary, that guides attach themselves to people who are interested in psychic and spiritual matters, and they look after them to make sure they're safe and not affected by any entities in what they called the lower astrals at the time, and also to guide them onto the pathway that is of interest to the individual. They don't force people to do things, they just guide them, not indoctrinated. So that was my introduction to the first two guides that came into my life. And in later years, I was joined by an Arab guide, and then the later one was Native American Indian with full headdress that Patricia saw, yes, as well as myself one day.
In the bedroom.
In the bedroom. I came out of the ensuite shower room, and there she was, sitting on the edge of the bed.
In tears.
In tears. Crying her eyes out. And I said, what's the matter, love? You know.
I remember that now.
Yeah. Well, I said, "Is everything all right?" And I wrapped the towel around me and went and sat next to her. And she said, "Can you see the Indian?" And just as she said that, I saw the Indian in full colour, almost solid, standing in front. She said, and then this love hit me. The Indian, he put his arms out like this. And the love hit me again. It's amazing, just almost unbearable. And yeah, it's very emotional for Patricia. And then Patricia said to me, "Can you see the Indian and can you feel the love?" And I just said yes. And we sat there soaking it up, and he got his arms out like that, and we stared at each other, the Indian and me and Patricia. It was wonderful, and that was the introduction to another guide that came in.
Yeah.
And I later found out that he was another spiritual minder, bodyguard, if it's like friends, and they each came in at different times. And the later one, and the gentleman that is still with us today.
Oh yes.
Yeah, came to me at a meditation group that I just joined in Harrow in Middlesex. And I'd just gone through an uncomfortable period in my life where my marriage dissolved and I was left on my own and feeling sorry for myself. And having just joined this meditation group, I didn't want to let them down, but I didn't feel like going because I was so depressed over what had happened. And a friend, when I spoke to her on the phone and said that I wouldn't be going that night, she said, "You jolly well come. You jolly well turn up." I said, "No, I don't feel like it, and I don't want to put a negative influence over the group." She said, "You jolly well come, and if you don't, I shan't ever speak to you again." So I felt obliged to go, because I didn't want to upset her. But I didn't feel like it, so anyway. Arrived at the premises, and we sat down in our chairs in a circle. And I thought, yeah, this is uncomfortable, feeling like I did. So I closed my eyes, put my hands on my lap like that, and the next thing I saw was a Chinaman. Very clear, almost solid, stand in front of me. He put his arms up his sleeves like that, and he went, "Greetings, you will not be lonely. And now I will make you laugh." And I thought, you haven't got a hope in hell's chance of making me laugh. Anyway, my lips started to move, go up in the corner like that. I had no control over it. And then I giggled. And then a full-blown laugh, hysterical laughter. I couldn't help it. I just laughed and laughed and laughed. Until I could feel the tears running down my face. I was laughing so much. And then Ron, who was sitting next to me, he started to giggle until he burst into full laughter. And then John, and then Vince, and then Jean, and then in anti-clockwise direction. I started to laugh one at a time until everybody was laughing hysterically. And then it stopped, just as if somebody had gone like that. We all stopped instantly. And Ron said to me afterwards, he said, "What the heck was that?" So I told him what I'd seen the Chinaman who bowed and said, "You will not be lonely. Now I'll make you laugh, and then I'll make everyone laugh." And he said, "Well, did he give his name?" So I said, "No, he didn't." So Ron said, "Well, you ought to call him Laughing Boy then."
Wow.
And so we did.
Mm.
And that was 1981.
Yeah.
And he's been with us ever since.
Yeah.
Now 2023. Yes. Very moving.
Yeah.
And he comes, visits us every morning when we do our meditation and read our healing list. So from that 40 years he's been there.
Mm.
And I did 15 years of clairvoyance and 25 years of spiritual healing. And he was there a lot of the time. And when I was doing the clairvoyance, and people would come up to me after the meeting and say, "Did you know you had a Chinaman with you tonight? Or did you know you had a Native American Indian?" And I used to say, "Yes, I did. I did know that because I could see them. But thank you for the evidence." So we have got quite used to spiritual beings from other dimensions being with us at various times.
Especially Laughing Boy.
Especially Laughing Boy.
Wow, he's a while.
He stayed a while, and he always makes us laugh.
Yes.
And see the funny side of life, because I've said many times that living on this planet, you will need a terrific sense of humour for this mad, mad world that we live in. If you haven't got a sense of humour, you're going to suffer. And even during the war, I was born before the war, so I grew up as a child during the war, World War II. And my dad used to say about the humour. My dad was in the army, but he used to say about the sense of humour amongst the armed forces. And my mother used to say about the sense of humour with all the neighbours and friends, despite all the bombings and having to live in an air raid shelter in our lounge and having to wear a gas mask when I slept, screaming my head off. The sense of humour was still there, and it was absolutely essential. So our guide said. So there we have a wonderful family of guides over the years. And I used to get quite nervous before doing the clairvoyance, because it becomes a trust that you're going to be able to fulfill what people want you to do. In other words, give evidence of their survival of their loved ones. And then when Laughing Boy used to come through and make me laugh before the start of the service, I always felt, yeah, I've connected now. And he was one of the main guides who used to guide people in to stand before me, the deceased loved ones of people out in the audience. He guided the friends and relatives to stand in front of me so that I could describe them. And sometimes the loved ones who came back from the astral planes to say to their loved ones, "I'm still alive but living in another dimension," they used to face the audience and I could only see the back of their head. So I had to say mentally to them, "Could you turn round and face me so that I can describe your face and hairstyle and colour of eyes and the other little things in life that the loved ones would recognise." Sense of humour, even during clairvoyant demonstrations. Several stand out, which I will mention, that made it all worthwhile. I was at Luton doing a clairvoyant service there many years ago, and there was an Indian gentleman, a Sikh, sitting in the front row, he had a blue turban, dressed immaculately. And instantly I knew I had to go to him, and I pointed to him, said, "I'm coming to you." And there, standing by my side, I could see a young man with a blue turban, aged about early 20s. And he told me what to say to the gentleman sitting down in the front row. And I said to the gentleman, "I've got your son here." Described him, blue turban, beard, body build, thin, quite thin. about 6 foot tall. And I said, he says that he was murdered, he was stabbed in a racial attack. But he's fine now, and he likes where he is in a comfortable world of love and light. And he forgives his attackers. He wants to stress that he forgives his attackers. Well, afterwards, the gentleman came up to me and he offered his hand. I put mine out and he grabbed my hand with both his hands and he went, "Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you." Went on for ages, didn't it, Patricia?
Yeah.
And I thought, he's never going to let go of my hand. And he kept saying, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." He said, "I cannot tell you how much you have helped me today." He said, "That's the first time I've had word from my son on the other side of life." So, of course, that was emotional for us as well, wasn't it? But that was just one of many that I've had to make it all worthwhile. Another occasion that was very moving was I was doing a service in Hemel Hempstead in Hertfordshire.
Oh, yeah, that was very special.
And there was an elderly gentleman sitting not far from where I was on the platform, aged probably mid-70s, when I was only in my 40s at the time, so he was considerably older than me. Smartly dressed with a tie, suit. And that I linked him with him. I knew I had to go to him. And at that instant I saw two of my guides, Native American Indian and an Arab, escorting, is the only word I could use to describe it, an elderly gentleman, quite small in stature, towards the front, facing the elderly gentleman sitting in the front rowish. And I described the gentleman and I said, "Your father is here and he's being escorted to the front, in front of you, and he wants your forgiveness. He is asking for your forgiveness. Will you forgive him?" Stony silence from the gentleman. I waited a while, so then I said again, "Your father wants your forgiveness. Will you forgive him?" Stony silence from the gentleman in front. He just stared at me. So I thought, well, I'm going to ask once more, and I didn't know what to do if he hadn't have answered then. So I said, "Will you forgive your father?" The gentleman in the front row went like this, elbows on his lap, head in hands, and sobbed his heart out. Cried and he cried and he cried. And that was very emotional. I was nearly in tears. There was stony silence from the audience. And eventually he looked up at me and he said, "Yes, I forgive him." So with that, the two guides, the Arab and the Indian, turned the gentleman round like that. Without touching him, they turned and he turned with them. And I said, "Thank you very much," to the gentleman in the front row. And the two guides marched his father off, and I could see a white, bright light with looked like a halo, blue halo round it, and they were taking him to the light. Afterwards, when I was having a cup of tea and a biscuit, the service was finished, the gentleman came up to me and he said, "Thank you for that." He said, "That was my father, as you described him, and I hated him. I actually hated my father. he used to thrash me, would take his belt off and thrash me till I was bleeding sometimes. For the slightest misdemeanour that I did when I was a child, he took great delight in tormenting me and thrashing me. And he said I hated him. I have gone decades hating my father in here for what he did to me as a child. And I said to the gentleman, yes, and he's sort of suffered torment on the other side of life. He can't rest until he had your forgiveness. So I said, it has helped both of you now to go on with your lives, you here and him in the spiritual worlds, knowing that you have forgiven him, you have he has your forgiveness. And I said, one thing I did feel when I was linked in with your father was that he was thrashed as a child and he knew no different. And he said, yes, I believe he was. He never got on with his father. So that, to me, proved a big point, that these things can go on down the generations. But that was another piece of mediumship that I said to Patricia on the way home that made the evening worthwhile.